Good report. All right, we'll convene our Burlington Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, January 24th, 2023. Welcome to everybody who's here. There are a few of us in the conference room, and we're hybrid again. See how this one goes. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it? Then we have our agenda as presented. Item 2 is a public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us on pretty much any item they'd like, whether it's on the agenda or not. And Charles, is there anyone who would like to speak?
We do. It looks like we've got at least 2 who would like to speak. We'll start with Sharon Busher. And then if you would like to speak, please hit the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll repeat that in the chat. And after Sharon, we'll go to Carolyn. Sharon, floor is yours.
Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to just say hi to Eric because I haven't seen him for forever.
How are you?
I'm okay. It's so good to see you on Zoom here.
Thank you.
So I'm calling about your second item, the inclusionary zoning amendment. And, you know, when the mayor and Megan, well, when the mayor spoke in general terms, I had taken down some notes about what was going to be anticipated about the flexibility for the different size bedrooms, et cetera. And that all made sense. But what I wrote down was that the ability to have that flexibility would be triggered by creating more than 20%, as opposed to what now the draft ordinance says 15.5%. And so my question for the Planning Commission and the Planning Department is, why 15.5%? What is so magical about that? Yes, it's greater than 15%, but why? Why isn't it 16%, 17? Why isn't it what was originally kind of batted around generically as 20%? And I know the table talks about different types of ratios based on the income. And that's table 9.1.8 dash, I guess so the draft ordinance that you have talks about that trigger at 15.5%. And my assumption is that means that if you meet that trigger, then it doesn't matter. I mean, all the other categories would automatically meet that because they're already greater than 15.5%. So it doesn't really need to be spelled out, I guess. I'm just saying that. The other point of that table is the category of student housing, and that's linked to the number of beds, not the square footage or anything. And so what is that trigger? Is that going to be one more bed than what? I mean, I feel like that does need to be clarified in order to provide a developer the flexibility to create different size rooms. They already do that, at least in the lofts. I mean, so I'm not sure that's as germane, but I still think if you're going to redo an ordinance, there needs to be some kind of guidance for the person that doesn't call Megan or Charles or one of you and actually looks at the legislation and tries to figure out if they comply or not. So those are my points. I really would hope that the commission would talk about why the 15.5% is that trigger, and how do you allow the student housing to qualify. It's because it says 15% of total beds. So would it be one extra bed? That seems like I don't know. That just seems odd to me. So thank you very much. You know my feeling on the South End. I know you've spent oodles of meetings and lots of time. I still am very concerned about the larger residential component. And even though there are criteria to allow other things to happen, so that the arts and everything, the life of the South End won't be diminished. At least that's the goal. I'm still not sure that if that gets built the way the zoning allows, that we won't be pushing out the arts and the creativity. And that really concerns me. Anyways, thank you so much for listening. And I'm going to stay and listen to your debate.
Thanks, Sharon.
Mhm.
Charles, is it Carolyn next?
Yes, next we'll go to Carolyn Bates. Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Oh, Carolyn, welcome.
Did you all, Charles, I sent you an updated version on Callahan Park View. Did you get that in your email?
Today I received one. I did forward on, I believe, one from Friday or yesterday. I'm not sure which.
No, you got it today, about a couple hours ago, and that's what we need to show.
You would like me to share that right now?
Yes. It should be a vertical that shows a scene of Callahan Park from Shelburne Street and some words underneath. There were some that were horizontal or square, but we want the vertical one. I want to know also why, when you show Callahan Park and you say there's no view in Callahan Park, whoever took the pictures only took a picture from the bottom, from the far west corner, and this is on a hill, so you're down at the bottom of the hill and says no view. Well, of course, you're at the bottom of the park. Then the park goes uphill, one hill, and then you show two more pictures there. One, and in both cases, you're standing on the north side, so you're just looking at a bunch of trees. You can't see across the park. Why didn't you move to the middle of the soccer field, to the middle of the baseball field, and above the tennis courts? Because there are views there, and I've gone to that park for years, and I like to see the view. But if you go and build these 8-story buildings, look at what you're going to block. Everything to the south of the Innovation Center. Okay? Do you see what I'm showing you? And there is some view to the north, and if we cut some trees down, we'll have a better view. If you keep your new housing at 4 floors, which is what the enterprise wants, it might be possible to build without losing the view, and you might be able to go to 5 stories, but you need to really study this issue, because the city is not to allow development if it blocks the views from public spaces. And that's exactly what you're doing here. And why you went and showed those other 2 pictures of Callahan Park instead of walking up and seeing the view, I don't know. But there is a view there, and it's my park. The other thing is whole development is going to do, if it goes higher than 4 stories, it's going to take the lake views from every single building in my neighborhood, which is 5 Sisters. And yes, I know you don't care if it ruins private people, but lake views mean more money for your house if you want to sell it. And I'm very concerned about you're taking the lake views here, but I'm also extremely concerned at anything built down there over over 4 stories, maybe a few 5, but not 8 stories. Please, this needs to be a neighborhood. It needs to be inclusionary. It needs to be friendly. It needs to have sun. And 8 stories won't do that. And I have blocked out, and you guys can put up to 8 buildings 85 feet high over the 1,000 square foot lineal area from Sears Lane to Lakeside. 8 85-foot buildings, plus another 7 or 8 4-story for the enterprise zone that you need to equal out with the housing. So I really want you to look at this and study it. And I want you to go look, and I want you to really, really consider ruining our neighborhood with 8 stories instead of 4, and taking all of our lake views. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Charles, is there anyone else?
It looks like that's it. Deborah Case is here, but it looks like she's just here to listen.
Okay. Well, thank you all who spoke. We'll close our public forum. Item 3 is the chair's report. I don't have anything to report tonight, so we'll move on to item 4, which is directed.
Sure, I'll be pretty quick. We just held an executive committee meeting just before this, so shared more full update with Bruce and Andy that we're making a lot of progress on really solidifying our planning team. It's been a great year of bringing on Charles and Sarah and onboarding them to a lot of the work that we've been doing, and I hope you've really enjoyed seeing the results of the skills that they've been able to add to our team and the discussions and other communication tools that they've added to a lot of our work. We talked about the fact that our work with the Planning Commission has transitioned from a lot of smaller zoning amendments, many of them moving through the process, to these larger, more complex amendments that take more of your time and require a lot more discussion over the last year. So while we have a shorter list of zoning amendments that have moved through the process over 2022, I think we've made a lot of progress in terms of addressing some of the really important challenges and opportunities that we have to work through here in the city. And we just shared that as we look ahead to the coming quarter, we do anticipate hopefully kind of moving through the 2 items that are on your agenda this evening, making some space to bring a couple smaller amendments to agendas for you for discussion. And we also do anticipate that you'll be seeing the next iteration of the institutional parking management plan later this spring. So a couple things to look ahead to, and otherwise, I think Sarah and I are both really happy. You may or may not know that in our data and analytics capacity, we've also been supporting some of the council's mapping and analysis of different redistricting map options. And so we're happy that last night the council voted on a final map to put on the ballot. So we're wrapping up our support for that process as of this week. So
Thank you. We'll move on to item 5, which is the proposed CDO amendment CA-23-01 South End Innovation District. We've had a lot of discussion on this one. We've had our public hearings. It's come back to us for final discussion. We've asked for some revisions and updates from Megan and Charles, which they gave us. That I think you already described all the ones that you've done.
We have described them. We're happy to get into them more if you'd like.
So it is really back to the commission right now. And is there any more discussion that people want? Is there any more thoughts or ideas? Or where do you want to go from here now? The next step, if we're taking action, would be, since we've completed the public hearings, the next step would be to forward it on to council.
And Andy, if I could,
Sure.
just remember that included in your packet, as you all discussed on the 10th, there is a memo that staff has written that really summarizes your discussion from that meeting, which is basically to say that the commission supports the amendment, but that alternative land use scenario frameworks were discussed, and that the commission recommends that council continue to look at the land use framework as it pursues its own deliberations of the amendment.
What's the commission's pleasure on this? Any comments? Questions?
Well,
Bruce, Bruce?
Thanks. So my only comment is I think the primary and secondary uses are really difficult. I think the zoning ordinance is a tough place to fine tune what the marketplace can do. I think we're entering into a really challenging phase in terms of when developments residential particularly can even occur, given interest rates and near doubling of construction costs in the last 18 months. And I think that point should at least be made in the memo that it's a substantial impediment to any residential construction there. I also think that that some discussion at some point, maybe it's not in the letter, of an enterprise zone or development zone there exempt from Act 250 would be important, because that's really another year to the process and another appeal avenue, and it's really redundant and expensive. So,
Andy, it's Eves.
Please.
So I want to jump on what Bruce is saying. You know, I was looking at the prescribed uses that were on the table the last time around, and how do I put this kindly? I don't think that what's suggested has any basis whatsoever in reality. I really do agree that you know, if you guys want commercial on the ground floor or limited commercial, I would say let the developer decide, let the market decide whether they want that commercial on the ground floor and whether it can be filled. You know, assigning square footages, things like that, I'm extraordinarily uncomfortable with that. If I remember, one of the categories was a restaurant, and you know, the restaurant was either 5,000 or 10,000 square feet. Those don't exist. I mean, that's an enormous restaurant. So you know, after our meeting, I really kind of thought about it, and this is a pretty momentous thing what we're doing with putting housing in the South End. And I'm not sure that I got a warm and fuzzy the last time that we were all on the same page when it came to height, that we were all on the same page when it came to prescribing commercial, et cetera. And you know, maybe the memo can reflect that, but I don't feel like we came to that nice consensus where everybody feels like, you know, we're all on the same page, and we might not agree wholly with everything, but we've come to a consensus. I don't feel we've reached that, and this is a big one.
You said
Say that again, Andy?
are you set for right now?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
Baker?
Yeah, I think there were just a couple comments, and I don't know if Charles wants to weigh in. A couple things that both Bruce and Eve shared that I thought might be helpful just for us to respond to. So in terms of the ordinance, when we talk about uses, for example, you know, I think I heard Bruce say something about, you know, the difficulty with bringing residential uses online. And I don't think that there is anything in this ordinance that would really mandate that a building needs to be residential. In fact, we've actually been concerned about the opposite, that we could see this area built out as exclusively residential without any commercial uses. And so we've tried to take, in terms of kind of on the scale of the tools that we could use to help ensure a mix of residential and commercial, we've tried to take a relatively light touch compared to other parts of the city. Where, you know, like in the downtown form code, for example, we say, you know, a certain depth of all the frontages on all the blocks downtown have to be some kind of active use. We used to have standards that mandated the % of residential or commercial uses in buildings in the downtown, things like that. We tried not to repeat things like that we know we've either peeled back as a city or have learned just don't work. So we tried to take a light touch. Residential can be built if it incorporates small amounts of non-residential, and we tried very hard not to say retail or overly prescribe what that non-residential component looks like. But ultimately, residential doesn't have to be built. It could be commercial development.
In addition to that, you know, the exemptions for ground floor active uses would allow residential buildings to be built without any non-residential component. You know, again, there's those 4 pathways for exemption, and if the building is on a secondary street, there is no requirement for those ground floor non-residential uses. It's only on the primary uses where there is a requirement, and the requirement again can be reduced from a significant amount, 80% down to a less significant amount of 30%. But this is a mixed use district, and you know, in an urban area where we've heard from property owners that they would like some capacity to develop non-residential uses, both that meet the intent of the innovation district, so arts and, you know, innovation and service use, community service uses, but also those, you know, inherent uses like restaurants, cafes, those sorts of things.
And the other piece is, you know, I wanted to acknowledge that, you know, after the last discussion, I would agree. I think that coming out of the last substantial discussion that the commission had about this, there were 3 pretty different suggestions that had been offered about how we deal with the land use framework. And you had asked us to go back and kind of look at one of those options, which was how we could provide some greater flexibility within the land use framework. And then also to pair that with the memo to the council describing how there could be more substantial changes to the land use framework if they wanted to consider them. So in making the sort of tweaks to the framework to make it more flexible, one of the things that has changed is that instead of requiring a one-to-one relationship between those primary and secondary uses, it can now be a 1-to-2 relationship. So you know, the examples that we've used of 5 or 10,000 square foot uses of any kind are purely illustrative. It's not a mandate by any means, and just using easy numbers so that it can be easy to describe that 1-to-2 relationship. So where before we would have said you had to have 5,000 square feet of X use in order to have 5,000 square feet of Y use. The example is, you know, you can have 5,000 square feet of X use in order to have 10,000 square feet of Y use. So tried to open up some more flexibility for how those non-residential uses mix together. And then the last thing I just wanted to speak to is this issue of Act 250. And I think I'll say to the commission, to the extent that you agree with that you have a lot of legislators who are currently in session, and I think it would be a great thing for them to hear from you. As a city, we have very, very limited tools available to us to actually get projects out of Act 250 jurisdiction. There are some limited kind of economic development zone designations that we can pursue through the state, but ultimately the Act 250 jurisdiction is only exempted for basically projects that need 20% inclusionary housing. So there is no current pathway available to the city within the city's control to get projects of a general nature out of Act 250 ratio. So I know that that's part of the mayor's agenda, and our office will definitely be involved in potentially involved in some discussions to propose some solutions, but I would encourage you in your own capacities as well to echo that to your legislators,
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else? Emily?
I think I'm agreeing with Eves on this, looking through some of the use table. And I know I've missed some meetings, so I apologize for coming in at the end here. But I think that this is such a large piece of property, and it's so ripe to be its own thing. And so, and I'm really not concerned about it being overly residential, because there's so much commercial happening in that neighborhood. So to force it to have a big commercial element just seems like it's adding a lot to it. Like there's so much forced commercial space right in that neighborhood. And then looking through some of the conditional uses and the use table, it doesn't seem like there's that much rhyme or reason to it. Like, you know, even like, I think co-housing is not allowed, and a community center is a conditional use. A cafe is a conditional use, like, what? Do we have to have, I mean, to open up a cafe in the ground floor of a building, you have to go through a conditional use? That seems ridiculous. I think that I personally like to see a lot of these uses open up to give more flexibility for the development to be what it needs to be. And I also just wanted to comment a little bit on the Lakeview issue and say that I think that those, you know, pictures that are being shown are like a lot of seasonal views, and there's going to be a lot of new lake views created by this development. And I think those lake views are held by some of the most affluent parts of our community. And to think that we're going to prevent low-income housing from being built and new development when we desperately need housing to preserve the lake views of a few people who live on the hill kind of makes me sick. So I really have no tolerance for giving up low-income housing in the middle of a housing crisis because of people wanting to preserve their personal lake views on private property. I think that there's lots of places where there's gorgeous lake views. There's going to be gorgeous lake views in this new development. Maybe we want to talk about having public access to some of the higher floors of these buildings so that there's new lake views created that have public access. I'm all about that. But to prevent there being density downtown in this great area because we're preserving lake views for a few people who live on the hill doesn't fly with me. So I'd really like to see some density here. I think that we're in a climate crisis and we need to be building housing in dense, walkable communities. And if we're not doing it because we're preserving lake views, we're just going the wrong direction.
Thank you, Emily.
I have to agree 100% with Emily on that. But
So do I. Make a clarification to the use table.
Yes.
So just to maybe clarify the use discussion. So these are not conditional uses as they're traditionally known. In fact, they're secondary permitted uses. So there would be no extra process that the developer would have to go through to get these uses permitted. It's simply arranged this way to remember, implement the intent of Plan BTV South End, which is to promote and foster arts, manufacturing, and the burgeoning office market. And we feel that without this sort of structured land use approach, it would be very easy to imagine a development where none of these, in fact, arts and innovation uses are developed. None of these sort of community-oriented uses like childcare would be developed. Simply, arts wouldn't be able to compete, for the rents that these spaces are going to be able to charge. So that's the way it is structured. And again, we did reduce the ratio from 1 to 1 to 1 to 2. And Eves, there might not be 5,000 square foot restaurants today in Burlington, but there are elsewhere. I don't mean to say that there would be one 5,000 square foot restaurant. There might be 3 that make up together 5,000 square feet. But looking at those uses in the primary use column, I would say that they do strike a balance and promote those arts and innovation uses, while I would say fairly easily allowing for some of those uses that are secondary in this land use framework, but we do acknowledge that they are important in a mixed use district. We're trying to create a dynamic district that is the sort of generator of economic development in the South End based on arts innovation that are there. So there's a few uses. Yeah, just know the community garden. There's a few uses that have relatively large footprints that could facilitate a good amount of these secondary uses.
And I think I just wanted to make sure, it might be a little confusing just because we also have a full copy of the full use table in the ordinance. So the way that this is structured is kind of like our other areas of, like, for example, the institutional district, where we have special overlays over the institutional district. So the actual table in the ordinance language modifies the broader use table for that overlay area. So you can disregard like where it says conditional use for a cafe in the BLM generally, because these are proposed to be permitted uses for all the uses that are allowed. And the only limit is just that ratio that we've been talking about.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, because it was confusing to me that the conditional uses.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Where do people, again, I'll ask again, where do people want to go from here? Are we ready to take action on it? Do you want to keep looking at this?
I just have one very minor note, which is the that bakery is a primary permitted use and cafe is a secondary permitted use, and you know, I'm just wondering about that distinction. And I
can answer that if you like. Some of it may seem arbitrary, and Megan and I did sit down and go through the entire use table, which is very long. And, you know, we did talk about bakery and cafe. And I think with bakery, you know, there's this artisanal component to a bakery that is necessary to the use of a bakery, and that might not be true in a cafe. A cafe might include a bakery as well, but it doesn't necessarily.
Roasters are really mad at you right now.
Yes, but that is essentially why. I mean, restaurant, cafe, those fall in that secondary category. That's essentially why we made call it bakery, because it's sort of more artisanal and manufacturing. It was in that primary.
Okay, thanks. I also just want to say I think that this mix of uses as a and I would not feel comfortable going further than what's currently in this memo with a 2-to-1 ratio, because any further, and I think we're at risk of losing the original intent of the district, which is to promote those 3 primary categories of office, residential, and arts. And yeah, I think that in order for this district to kind of blend into the fabric of the surrounding area, which does have a lot of commercial and residential, I think that tightening it, mixed use walkable district will help this be more organically integrated into the surrounding area, as opposed to, you know, high-rise residential buildings in a cluster or segmented uses. I just think this mixed use as it's promoted here is really important and in line with the goals for the district. So.
All right, thank you. So we need a direction to proceed. I hear comments from people, but not a different direction than continuing to move forward, at least nothing specific. Are there any specific recommendations that anybody has, or again, is there a motion to refer?
I mean, I feel like we have discussed this in great detail for a long time, have we not? And I mean, I would feel comfortable moving this forward. We have a couple commissioners who maybe not, so I'd like to hear from them.
I have a question on how big is the enterprise district and how big is the SEID?
Is there a picture?
Like acreage wise?
Overlay mass?
Yeah, the innovation district is about 65-70 acres total, which represents, I think, a quarter of the enterprise light manufacturing district. I can see if that's in this presentation. So, this is a map. I've got another presentation that I can bring up that shows the South End Innovation District in the context of the entire enterprise light manufacturing, but it's about a quarter of the ELM. And if you remember, former planning director David White presented to you all now about a year and a half ago and discussed the potential framework wherein the rest of the enterprise light manufacturing district could be looked at in future amendments for various reasons to strengthen the manufacturing component, to do other things. But it's about a quarter, and it's about 70 acres or so.
Charles,
Some of which is super fun, I think.
there's the, I think the overlay map is on page 13.
Yeah, there is a map in there.
Here it is.
There we go. Yeah,
So the area in red is the proposed innovation district, and everything in purple is the enterprise light manufacturing district. It's not within the proposed district.
So just one thing on note on the overlay district that's here is that it's a very underdeveloped section of the enterprise zone. When we've been trying to be very protective of this area, it's really been not this area so much because there's nothing really there other than there are a few buildings that are well established, and then it's a lot of open space. The further to the north is where a lot of the activities are happening, and then further to the south is where a lot of activities are happening. But in this one part that's right in the middle, it's really underutilized and underdeveloped. That's part of why I believe that we've been open to some of these more greater changes than we have been in other areas of the district, because there's really not a whole lot of what we would have otherwise thought of as the enterprise zone activities happening in this area. Certainly some, but not nearly what it is in the other areas. So it's like we carved this little area out.
intentionally.
Intentionally,
I mean, in
exactly.
terms of the recommendation to you, yeah, that was definitely an intentional part of the consideration. And I'll say, we have, as a commission, we have talked about what Charles mentioned earlier, that one of the major recommendations coming out of Plan BTV South End was for us to look at the enterprise district more specifically in terms of thinking about what mix of uses are not only allowed, but what types of uses we might try to incentivize in certain parts of the district. For some of the commissioners that have been around for a little bit longer, we've had a discussion about the far south end and how do we find the right balance between allowing for some greater flexibility of uses in the area that is kind of still more traditionally the manufacturing district, all the way up to this sort of arts district that's along the northern end of Pine Street. And yeah, this is in a lot of ways a blank canvas, and has a lot of opportunity for us to be re-envisioned, And I think also part of the reason why, at least in our discussions with community members and other stakeholders about this area, why there has been a greater level of support is because of that intentionality, both with geography and with how all of the components of land uses could come together. I definitely hear and acknowledge the idea that, this area, we're not really as much at risk as displacing artists, for example, because there aren't artists here. And we know that a lot of artists are looking for housing. So that's, a big part of the reason why this framework allows for developments that could be a significant portion of residential, or could have a significant portion of residential. We're not mandating that arts have to be part of every single project, because we acknowledge that. But it does also, I think, kind of similar to what Julie was saying, from our perspective in terms of a recommendation for how you implement Plan BTV, it does feel awkward in terms of the policy kind of intent and consistency to move it forward without any kind of consideration for the compatibility of potential new uses in this area.
Anyone else?
I just have a quick
Sure.
question. Does the overlay district extend to the lakefront or no?
The way that you're seeing that purple edge is because that's actually capturing a buffer around the parcel, which is just a function of how our zoning district boundaries are drawn. So the red line is the edge of basically the lake shore on land. So, yeah.
Bruce?
I guess, first of all, I thought what Emily said was really well said. And it seems like I live this dream over and over again. Every time we want to do housing somewhere, we find a good reason not to do it and to restrict it. And the more impediments you put up in this environment to residential construction by imposing some commercial uses that may not be marketable, the less likely you get any. And I don't think that's a good idea. I do think there's room, the already built environment is vibrant. And I also don't think it's a zero-sum game, meaning if it was all residential in this 6 acres or whatever it is, with commercial on the first floor, they would be synergistic with the other uses that are artistic uses. People who get coffee would buy Conan or Grannis or, would support all those things. I think it would contribute to a vibrant district. And when we try to prescribe it and the market won't produce it, we get nothing. And I don't think
agree.
Bruce, let me ask you, is there a proposal that you can offer?
Yeah, I think it would be that, and Emily, I liked your thoughts, that first floor commercial would be any commercial use in the use table and the residential without this primary secondary thing.
I second that.
Let me understand you is what you're suggesting. There's the table 4.5.8-3 that has the uses permitted and limited within the SEID. Are you suggesting that just be that the primary and secondary in essence be merged together in that table?
As permitted uses, yeah.
As permitted uses without the distinction between primary and secondary.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with that also. Sorry if anybody else is.
No, go ahead, Emily.
I agree with that also. I'm reading this primary and secondary use table and I'm thinking, why? Like, what makes a film studio a secondary use to a office? Why? I don't see any rhyme or reason to it. And I think it's just limiting and complex when it doesn't need to be.
So Emily, maybe you could make a motion. It sounds like we might have.
You did, Bruce.
Okay, great. Yeah.
You made the
Good.
motion to combine the two and it was seconded by Eves.
Okay.
And so that's actually what's on the table right now for our discussion.
I guess I'd pose a question. What are we afraid of?
So
We're afraid that there's going to be a bigger film studio than a bowling alley.
Yeah, that's
You know?
precisely it, is that film studios tend to be extremely large footprint. I actually don't think a film studio that's 15,000 square feet, that's less than 15,000 square feet would be built. I think you look at the
Nobody's
cities.
building a film. Nope, sorry to interrupt.
Right, if you look at the cities where film studios are built, they're extremely large buildings, much larger than 15,000 square feet. Office is included because, again, going back to Plain BTV South End, it references the nascent office sector in the South End that has grown since that plan was adopted, and this district has always been intended to promote that. And I think we've heard that from the advisory committee who helped us at the beginning of the process, to include property owners, to include ULA, Food Generator, CBOEO. That's, generally what we've heard.
Can I add?
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Vermont Innovation Center's here and I think office is an important dimension of the area already. So that certainly needs to be a part of the district prioritized in the future. But I think Sharon mentioned this in her comments that she's afraid that arts uses would be crowded out. And I think that's my main concern with combining these use, the primary and secondary categories, is that those smaller arts uses will not be able to outcompete some of the other ground floor residential uses. And if ground floor commercial retail. I think also some of those arts uses may not be suited for that just a smaller ground floor area. They might demand a larger area that's like a standalone structure. And I feel like the proposal in front of us right now, in our packet rather, is allows for those flexibility, that flexibility of commercial and different types of structures. So I don't have enough, I don't really have confidence in this combination of the primary and secondary uses on the ground floor right now to effectively allow all of the arts uses that are really important to the area as it exists right now, with generator there and the surrounding area. So.
Megan, did you?
Oh, I was just, the only other thing I was gonna add is, I don't, from my perspective, I don't take like personal pride in what is here. I think what we have done as a staff is try to balance what we're hearing as like this idea of more flexibility with other considerations and concerns that we've heard from others about this in and of itself, as it's written, represents a pretty sweeping change to how development could occur in the ELM district today. The introduction of any residential use on its own is a sweeping change. And I think we have just tried to kind of carefully listen to different perspectives about opening the door without completely taking the door off the building, if for lack of a better analogy. And have tried to just kind of finesse the uses in ways that we felt were responsive to a variety of different perspectives about this. So I don't think that when we say what are we afraid of, I think it's important to recognize that maybe it's not anything that the commission or the staff necessarily is afraid of, but just trying to be responsive to lots of different considerations for how this area evolves. Oh shoot, I had one other thing and I just forgot what it was. So
Andy?
Come back as soon as you remember. Alex.
So this version we're talking about tonight is already a compromise because Megan and Charles changed the use table primary to secondary use ratio from 1:1 to 2:1, right? So this is in essence a liberalization. Julia, you said something. You said you weren't comfortable with it as it currently exists. That would guarantee enough arts.
I wouldn't be comfortable going further than the 2:1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have a ratio off the top of your head?
No, I said I wouldn't be comfortable. Like the 2:1 is the furthest I could.
Sorry. I don't know. What I'm struggling with is, I'm listening to the actual planners in the room that we're trying to do is, with planning, zoning is clumsy and it's so front loaded. How do you know what's going to happen? When is this going to be built? Is it going to be 5 years from now or more? Like, the market conditions might change between now and then. So I think we just have to move forward with some plan. I'm still okay with this.
I think the problem is when you impose a prescriptive requirement and the market changes, and it will, you end up with some buildings that will never be built. We can't impose it because it's mostly built with private dollars. And that means the residential goal, even though we want it to occur, we wrote it down on the page. If you force someone building a big building to rent at a lower rate a big portion of the building, that building may not ever pencil out and may not ever get built. And I think we're throwing away a lot of residential opportunity by doing that. And I agree with Emily. We are sitting in a room and we are hurting the poorest of us by doing that.
Yeah, Bruce, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. Are you more concerned with the requirement that buildings have non-residential uses on the ground floor? Are you more concerned with the land use table, or is it both equally?
I'm fine with it having non-residential uses on the first floor, but prescribing which ones work at any given time. We are dealing with a historic ordinance in 1985 that doesn't make sense anymore. And we're struggling with it now. We never change it. You know, you've heard me say that there's an exemption in our bankruptcy code for 2 yoke of oxen up until like 8 years ago. We never let go of regulation once we create it, even if it doesn't make sense anymore. And in this case, it prevents people from having a place to live. People who walk in that neighborhood will shop at all those artistic uses, because the entire building won't be built if you prescribe a certain commercial use that can't be made, that brings down the pro forma so it doesn't pencil out.
It doesn't just bring down the pro forma, it may never lease. Because you're prescribing a use without even really knowing what the environment is. You can't do that. I mean, this is what I do for a living. It doesn't work. It just doesn't. It looks nice on paper. Oh, we'll have a restaurant here and a cleaner there and a seamstress here. It doesn't work. It has to be a place where people go, where there's adequate parking and visibility. You can't prescribe it. You can't.
Charles?
Yeah, I just want to maybe take a step back and think about the requirements for ground floor uses and specifically the way it interacts with the block perimeter standard and the designation of streets. So recall that the district establishes a block perimeter of 1,600 feet. And we propose in the amendment that at least one block face has to be designated primary. But that's as far as we go. So if you then take a look at the ground floor use requirement on a primary street or a street with a primary frontage, the ground floor non-residential use requirement is 80%, and on secondary streets, it's 30%. Then if you go further, there's those 4 pathways for exemption. There's affordable non-residential space, there's detached non-residential space, so something like a Linux kiosk or a shipping container that's a food cart, that sort of thing. There's open space that has minimum dimensions such that it makes it a usable public amenity. And then the last one is family size units in the building itself. So that's 2 and 3 bedroom units. So essentially, when you combine all that, if you take, let's take, the sites south of Lakeside Avenue, if they build a street running through the middle and designated that the primary street, only those buildings fronting on that primary street would have any ground floor requirement if they pursue some of those exemptions, which in my opinion are very attainable. I think the open space in particular seems to be one that will be inherently included given the lot coverage and FAR standards here. I think the detached non-residential exemption option was actually made in recognition that there is a great wealth of poverty, I would say, of vacant ground floor space across the country and probably including in our region. There's also, I think, the standard that says that some of this ground floor space can be, I would say, very small dimensionally. And that was also in recognition that some of these new ground floor spaces might not be leasable. So again, in totality, a lot that's as big as 6 acres may only have a couple of blocks worth of non-residential uses at its ground floor, and they could be very small. So that's, I think, I would just remind you that it's a sort of balance working between the urban form and the land use component that we're trying to strike here.
Yeah, I think maybe just to take that illustration one step further, you know, the maximum floor plate of a building is 15,000 square feet. So for rough illustration purposes, we're talking about a building of 100 by 150 feet. So you can imagine how if the 100-foot facade is that primary facade, you know, to meet the intent of this ordinance, we're really only, am I doing my math right? We're really only talking about the potential of about 250 square feet of non-residential space in order to meet the requirement. So, you know, that's a small, very small cafe. You know, there's a lot of things that could easily be done to meet the intent of these requirements. And then I think where somebody opts into commercial space at a much greater percentage of a project's overall gross floor area is where that 1 to 2 really starts to become more of a consideration.
I think the problem is, Megan, is you're at the tipping point. If we want to, if there's a 20%, let's say, inclusionary requirement, and under current costs, the developer has to lose money to do it, any more tips them over. And that's a big problem. I mean, it's a reason there are very few producers of housing, because they can't take the risk that some use, that no matter how small it is, because they've already dedicated 15 or 20% of the square footage to a use that's going to lose money if it's a residential development. And we want to encourage both inclusionary. To me, that's a higher priority. And I also think it would be supportive of the arts uses around it. I don't think there would be none. I think there would be some in this development. And I also think they'd be supportive of the makers that already exist there.
Yeah, I also look to maybe fold in some of these responses, because if the primary permitted uses and the secondary permitted uses were all folded together, so they were all just permitted uses, are there any of the secondary ones that you would say, well, let's not do those then?
I think there would be, yeah. I think, again, thinking about some of these uses, I know questions have come up before too, like things like boat sales or rentals. You know, the reason that's there, it might sound really silly. I remember the point I was going to make earlier, which is that we are in what I think is the unfortunate position of the fact that over time our use table has grown to be incredibly prescriptive. I think it doesn't benefit us well, so we have to try to decide how things fit. And so for some of these, instead of just simply saying like, let's discard them all together, we said, you know, let's keep this as part of the potential mix, but we'll just subordinate it to the types of uses that we might really want to see here. I think if you were going to combine these categories together, yeah, there probably would be ones that we wouldn't recommend be part of that. So I think the other piece that I was just going to respond to, I appreciate your point there at the end, Bruce, about, you know, yeah, we have heard the similar concerns from, in particular, like nonprofit housing developers, for example, that both the funding and their kind of business model does not result in mixed use buildings. They want to build residential buildings only. And so that actually is a, you know, pretty compelling point that we haven't talked about before. But I think when I hear the concern about demanding commercial space, it seems like maybe the concern is more about the ground floor activation standards and the requirement that a building have any activation, whether they can pursue these alternative processes for essentially getting out of doing that or not. It sounds like that's more the concern. And then I think that the combination of primary and secondary uses, especially at a 1-to-2 ratio, still provides a fair amount of latitude and flexibility for how someone who might choose to add commercial space of any significance to a project might be able to achieve that intent. So I think kind of listening to this conversation, personally, you know, my recommendation would be if you wanted more flexibility, that we think about those activation standards rather than the mix of uses themselves. But I know that's opposite of the motion that you've already made.
But it's part of the discussion.
It is part of the discussion.
Any more discussion on this?
I like that idea. I get it. I think that kind of avoids some of the pitfalls that you were just talking about of some of those uses that right now are classified as secondary for reason.
And it does sound like there might be some good merit to that. What do others think?
It sounds like there's a motion there.
No, not yet. We're still on Bruce's motion. But it's part of the, it's all part of the discussion, you know, and if people are done talking, we could vote on the motion, but any further thoughts on what Megan was just talking about?
Well, what would that look like, Megan?
Yeah.
So it's table 4.58-2, the second column there, minimum lot frontage occupied by building, primary 80, secondary. Oh, I'm sorry. Third column, 80% minimum primary, 20% secondary. So it would be eliminating those completely, or you could decide to lower those thresholds.
Yeah, I think then if we remove that piece of the column down below where we talk about item B, so yeah, right underneath it, B and the sub bullet of B, we would probably also end up striking that too, because that talks about essentially the dimensions of what that ground floor activation looks like for non-residential.
So you don't have all those like little requirements. You just say, we want some of this to be activate the street. We want some of it to be non-residential on the ground floor. It doesn't matter where.
Yeah, we would still have activation standards in the sense that we would want buildings to kind of meet the street or, you know, come close to the setback to provide that level of activation. We still have something in here about entries, and that's really just to make sure that you're not looking at the back sides of buildings. But instead of saying, you know, we want 80% of the building's facade on a street to have some sort of non-residential use happening in it, we would just allow for whatever use occupies that ground floor based on the development.
Actually, sorry, as I think about this one more, I do like the idea of having the commercial uses on the ground floor if we can, because that's what creates a more interactive area. That's what we were trying to do in our downtown and certain parts of it. Just it creates a more friendly pedestrian walkway, you know, interaction between the building and the sidewalks and ultimately the streets. So my preference, I think, is still, I think that's a good idea you proposed, and it could be a workaround, but I think my preference would still be to have, if we can, more of the non-residential uses on the first floor that can engage people from the street. And I'd just be worried that if we gave that up, we might be losing an awful lot.
So is the concern, like you're saying, require that the non-residential uses can only be on the ground floor? I guess I'm wondering if that's really a concern. It seems to me like the market is really driving for residential build. So we're worried about spaces that could be residential turning over to commercial? I don't think that, maybe I'm wrong, but that doesn't seem like a real threat. It seems like if you require the ground floor to be commercial, that's gonna prevent it from being residential, because that's what the market is demanding.
Yeah, I think
Am I
that
right?
was what Andy was saying, the
Okay.
latter part is what he was saying. Yeah, I mean, the reason I proposed this is because I think what I was hearing is that the concern that the current market may not want to build anything if there's a requirement that the ground floor has to contain commercial uses. So that, you know, I think that we agree from the
Yeah.
perspective, that's why we recommended
Right,
it here.
right.
In terms of activation of the street frontage, but if the concern is really that this is gonna produce unworkable developments or developments that won't happen at all, that's the way to approach it.
Bruce?
I like Andy's point. I think activating the streetscape's important. And if the commercial uses are broad enough, I think both will be inhabited in a vibrant way where people live, work, and play in the same place, which is really what we're trying to create organically. We want people to live, work, and play in the same place, shop at all these maker spaces, and support everyone. And I think I like the commercial activation of the use. I just don't like restricting it to something that in 4 years may not even exist in the marketplace. And that's what some of those primary and the secondary use restrictions do. So I'm still at the same place.
Okay, sorry, I think I misunderstood the point you were making about what would be built.
So the commercial uses, if they were broadened, if you could have all the commercial uses or close to it that are both primary and secondary, it would both activate the streetscape. And I believe a developer could, nonprofit or for profit, could figure out how to make that entirety work, because you've offered them the opportunity to financially make up for the inclusionary loss by giving a broad array of commercial uses available to them. Some commercial uses are good, do support, it's kind of like a wetlands. They demand a high dollar rate per square foot, and they can support the pro forma of the rest of the building, so it does work. And then so you could then so that's why I think restricting the commercial uses is a mistake, but allowing the commercial uses of all sorts or nearly all sorts and on that table would do both. Allow for a vibrant, walkable area where people will live, work, and play, but also produce a lot of housing.
Megan?
I think so.
I have a question, Bruce. If, you know, if there's a developer that's looking at, you know, a residential development and there's commercial space that, say the ordinance says it's currently in front of us, is adopted. And they're providing some of those, commercial uses in the scenario that you were sort of just describing. I feel like that's compatible with what's here, where, you know, they're meeting that, that ratio or exceeding that ratio of the primary and secondary permitted uses. So I want to understand more about like how the greater array of commercial uses is what's really important, because and that those be primary uses, because I feel that, you know, in providing the housing, which is a primary use, it unlocks the secondary use automatically. So it is possible to have that wide array of uses. Am I not understanding that?
Well, just to clarify, residential uses are, it's only the non-residential uses that work into that ratio. So residential uses do not in themselves unlock those secondary permitted uses. It's only the non-residential primary use.
You know, it's just because it's prescriptive. So imagine you were going to buy a car and you had to put a $10,000 deposit down, and you're not going to get the car for 3 years, and you don't know if your car is going to be a transit van or another kind of vehicle, or what color it's going to be, and or if there's going to be any demand for its use at the end of that 3-year period, you're asked to put that money up front. That uncertainty, that creation of that uncertainty, it's what's causing our housing crisis. It's it's the reason why not many folks want to take that risk. They're paying poker with money without knowing what the market's going to be several years down the road for a billiard parlor or a community center. And they would like the flexibility to know, to have that confidence that, gee, if that first floor space, it should be entirely a tap room, that it could be, because then they'll build the rest.
Quick
And
question. I have a question.
They don't want to be told that they have to build it. You know, at the end of the day, I need to add something that doesn't seem to be coming up in the dialogue. You know, this is not New York City. This is Burlington, Vermont. And so what we're talking about commercial uses on we'll call them streets, because it's all in the future, that are going to be very lightly traveled, especially because everyone's going to be using public transport. And so there's going to be very little to, you know, the foot traffic that's going to be there. There'll be a tiny bit. There's not going to be much though. And you got to remember, there's not a whole lot of people living here. There's 45,000 people here. And so what that means is, you know, businesses don't generate that much revenue. And if you put a business on a side street, like is Eric still in the room?
Yes.
Eric Farrell. So Eric, you know, like
He's shaking his head no that he's not here.
on Cambrian Way, right? Let's say you put a in the CHT building. Let's say you put a storefront on that CHT building. How much business do you think that storefront would get? None. Zero. Because you can't see it, you can't find it. It's completely invisible. So it's completely destination. And so again, you guys, it's a nice idea to put commercial on the ground floor everywhere, but it doesn't work in practice. People need to have customers to support their businesses. And so again, you know, all I'm pushing on is this prescribing it. You know, and you've got a great example sitting in the room there, because you got a guy who had a whole building and a half, and he had these great visions of commercial space. And guess what? Nobody came in years.
Great. I think that just, you know, I don't mean to belabor this point, but I think I am listening to what you're saying, Yves, and I think that's why we suggested that maybe not requiring the ground floor activation requirement might be the way forward here.
I would agree with that, I think.
I'm okay with either one of those if we get away from the primary or secondary.
I do think Megan's suggestion to remove that requirement is more to the intent of Plan BTD South End and what we've heard from the community and elected officials about the land uses in this district. I think removing the distinction between primary and secondary completely sort of eliminates the planning foundation of this district from a land use perspective. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Let me ask a question on the just to make sure I understand. On the primary and secondary uses, that applies both on the first floor but for the whole building. So
The whole lot.
the whole lot, suppose.
The whole lot, and remember, yeah, one of the other recommendations was that planned unit developments are permitted, and they are.
So I think the big concern that I'm hearing is primarily on the first floor where they have to do the non-residential. The rest of the building, there's a choice to do residential or non-residential. Suppose the distinction between the primary and secondary uses, that on the first floor, you could do either in whichever ratios you want to do, but for the rest of the building, you have to follow this primary, secondary 2-to-1 ratio. That would.
I think that might actually kind of go in the opposite direction of the discussion that we're having, and that it would be even more prescriptive and probably even harder to administer.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I asked. Okay. We have a motion. Any more discussion? It sounds like the motions hasn't changed, and there's nothing that's really changed about the. So,
Andy,
Well-
can I ask you a question?
yes,
So it appears that Megan's idea is more persuasive to Eve's. I'm not sure what Alex and Emily think on that. I sounds like Eve's isn't afraid of these all being residential uses on the first floor. How do you feel, Andy? Because you're the one that raised that.
actually, I'd like to hear from some others. Like Julia
Maybe
or
we-
Alex.
Yeah, maybe
Emily?
we can go around.
I mean, I guess I go back to the work that we did with form-based code, right? Where we basically said, we want you to create the infrastructure and the activation style of commercial uses. So that's like windows, the amount of glazing, the entryways, that are inviting, to really suggest that we want retail there and to give that activated streetscape, but we didn't require the use. I think that I'd like there to be flexibility here so that these buildings get built. I don't know, I'm sitting in a neighborhood with like this abandoned YMCA at the corner that is filled with graffiti. Down the street, there's an empty pit. I just see things not happening, and I'd really like to give that flexibility. Ideally, I want a walkable neighborhood with with commercial shops and uses on the streetscape that people are going to want to interact with. And I think that has to do with infrastructure, and the actual placement of these businesses has to do with business cycles and the economy. And we can't really force that, but we can make sure that the infrastructure exists. So when it's a time and place for it, it will be there.
I can agree with that.
If I were to summarize, are you thinking that it's more important to keep the non-residential ground floor requirement than the list of what uses could go in it? Is that how?
Yeah, I think I personally liked there to be non-residential ground floor uses on the streetscape fronting. I don't know, these buildings might be big enough that there may be areas that are not, fronting, that have non-residential uses, or the backs of buildings are not on the main part. So, but I think we all share the desire that this be a vibrant neighborhood with an active streetscape that invites people to walk around, and having, non-residential uses makes neighborhoods feel safer because there's people around, walking around and such. So I definitely want to encourage non-residential uses on the first floor streetscape, and I guess require it. But I think I'd like to provide a lot of flexibility as to what that is. And I don't feel the need prescribed that it needs to be, a research lab as a primary over a laundromat.
Thanks. So, Julia.
Yeah, I think I'm repeating myself.
Okay. All right.
But I'm totally sympathetic to the idea that this district is for housing, and so I think stymieing that progress is not in anyone's favor, but I don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face and lose the other complementary things about the district that it could potentially support.
Alex.
I'm quite conflicted, like,
Yeah.
I want the housing to get built too, but you don't want it to just to be all housing, and so that there's never the opportunity in, 10 years from now to put non-residential uses on the ground floor. So,
I think, Emily, the way you put it is very similar to what my thinking is, which is we want the ground floor to be, the non, at least a part of it to be the non-residential, but I'm less concerned over what that non-residential is. Because it does change over time, uses on the first floor change. I mean, they just change all the time. Someone will move in, try it for a little bit, they either stay or they don't, and then somebody else will come in. Just want to make sure that it doesn't get stuck as being empty. Because then I think that's what, what others have been talking about is when it's stuck as empty, there's a fear that it will be, and the thing won't get built to begin with.
I also do think it's, if it was a 3-story area and you require 1 story to be commercial, that's different than 1 of 8. Because there's the ability for the market to figure out where it can make it work in one portion of the building to support the part that may lose. So, I know I've been back and forth, but I if we have support for it, I think just eliminating the distinction between primary and secondary would be what I can support that. And I think Emily.
So that's what your motion was.
Right.
And I am supportive of that, but I do, the one caveat with that is I would like, at least at the beginning, for Charles and Megan to go through that list and see if there are any recommendations over what uses then, should be either eliminated or changed, because the way it is right now, it is a primary and secondary list. I just would want to make sure that we're not then putting something in just a general permitted use that we really don't intend to be there. That's the only caveat I would put on that.
I wouldn't be prepared to say that tonight.
Yeah, I get that.
And so I think, we've also had a lot of discussion about just how much discussion we've had about this. And so I would think that if you would be interested in having us take a look at that, we could do so as it's, kind of in transit to the city council.
That would, I normally don't go along with things like that, but I think that distinction over what's going to be, permitted or not permitted, the council, I would imagine, is going to go through it. So, and Megan and Charles will be making their recommendations to the council. So I'm comfortable with that in this circumstance. Any other discussion on Bruce's motion? Then I think we could vote on that motion. So the motion was essentially to combine the primary permitted uses and the secondary permitted uses and just have them all be permitted uses in this overlay district. Do I have that right, Bruce?
Yes.
Okay. Any last final discussion comments? I don't see any. So all in favor of that motion, say aye or raise your hand. Say aye.
Right.
aye.
Okay. That's any.
Hold on. Yes, I'm opposed.
Sorry, did you catch the vote, Sarah?
It was. Eve said no, everybody else said yes, I think.
You? Yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
No, you could,
No.
okay. Then. Is there the next motion? Is there any other discussion before we move to the next motion, which would be to refer to council? Then is there a motion to refer to council? And the only thing in the motion, if there is one, that I would ask is that Megan and Charles, in combining the use table, to look at it to see if there are any other changes that need to be made over what should be allowed and not allowed. Emily, I saw your hand going up.
I was making a motion to refer this to city council.
And is that with the recommendation and the memo?
Of course.
That's what I thought. Alex, is that a second?
No,
Okay,
Second.
Can I ask just a clarification question?
Bruce, did you get a second?
Yes.
Okay, Megan, yes, sorry.
Sorry, Alex, I thought you were joking. I apologize that I jumped in there.
I'm
Okay.
not, no, I have a question for Andy, which is, you know, it's not about Emily's motion. I have other questions about this before it, you know,
Oh,
this whole
we
thing
can take-
sails away.
Yes, we can,
Okay,
with the, we have the motion and second on the table now, so more discussion. Alex,
I'd like to hear why Eves voted no on a motion that he appeared to be in favor of. And, you know, I don't think that, right, you know, banks or whatever other uses were gonna do much after 5 o'clock either, like boat repair, you know?
Eves, did you hear that question?
I certainly did, Andy.
Okay,
So Andy, I'm gonna put my old man Burlington hat on. So, you know, down the street from your house, Andy, and this is on South Union Street at the corner of South Union and Howard. So down that street, there was a boat repair shop next to the Fitchelo's house. There was a fire station 2 doors down from my old house. There was a little general store a little further down next to the Rotary. Now, those are the 3 that I know of, and they're all residential now. So what happened was the market said, hey, you know, this is what we want. And then the market said, this is not what we want. And so the market decided. And now it seems like the market's going back to like having the small things in communities because that's what we seem to want on the ground floor. But it's funny because when we talk about residential neighborhoods, not apartment neighborhoods, nobody wants it. But I guess the reason I'm not comfortable with it is when I felt really good about it, when it was just sort of like, you know what, we're going to let the market decide what should be on these ground floors, which goes back to what Bruce said. I'm all for activating the streetscape. But again, my job, or part of my job, is to talk to people who want to open businesses. And if, you know, I say to them, do you need people to see your business? Do you need people to be reminded of your business? And those are the successful businesses. And the ones that are our destination, where it's like, okay, I'm getting married and I make wedding dresses. Well, those can be like where nobody sees them. But most businesses can't survive without really a good amount of foot traffic and a good amount of people traffic. Like right now, the Innovation Center won't support a cafe. There's just not enough people there. And so again, that's why I'm not comfortable. I know I'm kind of going on about it, but because to me, I understand what you want to do. And in a perfect world where we would live in a more metropolitan environment, having all the streets activated makes a lot of sense. I'm not comfortable with this one.
thanks, Steve.
I have a question about what you're referring, just to make sure that we're clear. So typically your motion about the memo refers to the staff report that accompanies a zoning amendment and making sure that that gets referred. In this case, the packet also has a memo that we had prepared for you based on your discussion 2 meetings ago about sharing with the council that there are other, other ways that they could consider the land use framework. I think a lot of that memo is irrelevant at this point based on the motion you just made. So I think we just wanted to clarify whether you wanted that to be referred to them or not.
What you might want to do is almost flip it back to the way that you know, if you understand.
Yep.
So
Like the
that
staff has recommended this.
because there's a different recommendation, and I would imagine you're probably going to share that with them anyhow. So I just will be clear that this was a big part of our discussion.
So then,
And does that make sense to people to do that?
yes.
Do you understand the question? Okay, when we were keeping it as the 2 separate uses, the primary and secondary uses, we had asked Megan and Charles as part of the memo that we're giving to the council to explain the alternative way, which could be where they get combined. But now that we're combining it, I think it actually would be advisable to have them go back and say, there's another way of doing it, which we discussed, ultimately didn't choose to go that way, but just to have the primary and secondary, which is the way that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, I think if Emily, who made the motion, and I think Bruce, who seconded, is supportive of that, we can certainly do that and share a revised version with you, Andy, to review before it gets referred.
So that makes sense to people. Emily?
Yeah, I guess I just want to add like about the commercial first floor use. Like I think about the places that I know that are newer developments that don't have a commercial element on the first floors. And what I can think about is like on Shelburne Road behind the grocery store, like near where Lund is and like the Starbucks area. Behind there, there's a bunch of, you know, sort of newer in the last 10-year apartment buildings that have gone in, and that area is just strictly housing back there. There's no commercial, no anything. And I'm thinking if we don't have a commercial ground floor, that's what it's going to be like. And I just think that's kind of an unappealing, very insular neighborhood that's not very inviting. Like there's no reason to go there or be part of that neighborhood, except for if you live there. So it becomes strictly a destination and a private kind of enclave for the people that live there. So I do think it's important. I definitely support lots of flexibility and want these projects to get built and want to limit the regulation, but I really don't want to see something like that built right in the heart of, you know, the South End in this, what should be like a really walkable, vibrant community. So I think it's really tough position to be in that you want to incentivize that from happening. But I do think the structure and infrastructure that you put in for a building matters. Maybe it's not used as that, but it suggests that it shall be used for that in the future.
Anyone else? So
I'm still just confused as to why Eves would vote against this proposal when he seemed to be in favor of being not restrictive as to the commercial uses. I mean, you know,
It's not restrictive enough.
correct me if I'm wrong, Keith, but I think what you were saying is you don't want any restrictions.
Right.
Yeah, I'm suggesting that look, the market will tell you immediately whether it's viable or not. If it's viable, that's the way it'll go. But if it's not, it won't. That's all.
So we have the motion on the table. And Megan and Charles, you're clear on what our motion is, and Sarah, you're clear? Okay. Any more discussion on that? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to refer to the council with the memo as amended, say aye, raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed?
But now you support it? Jeez, we're on a roller coaster ride.
No, I mean, I don't support what we agreed to, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to oppose sending it to council. I mean, we're not going to change it. So of course we're going to send it to council.
Okay.
Good, thank you. This has been a long, hard discussion, lots of good inputs on it, lots of movement around it. And Megan and Charles, thank you also for your help on this. This is a pretty significant thing that we're doing, and be curious to see how it navigates its way through the council. Thank you all for your help.
Yeah, particularly want to say thanks to Charles. He did the vast majority of the work on this. And appreciate all of your discussion about the various elements of it.
Okay, so we'll close that item, move on to item 6. I know it's getting late. I don't think this is going to be a big discussion tonight, but we have proposed CDO amendment ZA-23-02 inclusionary zoning. At our last meeting, we heard a presentation. We gave a lot of feedback on it. I think we were very close to voting on it, but we wanted Charles and Megan just to finish up perhaps some final revisions to it. If you want to share with us what you've done, and then see where we go from there.
Sure. To quickly summarize, last time, there were 3 recommended parts of this amendment. The first has been struck. I think basically this reflects your discussion from last time, that you think the second provision sort of covers what the first would have. Anyway, so there was, regarding number 2, there was discussion that particularly Michael raised about projects where the ground floor area of inclusionary zoning units does not exceed the % required in that table. Is there a path, is there an alternative pathway for those projects? And we looked at that and ultimately determined that at this time, we wouldn't recommend addressing those projects where the ground floor area is less than that. So in a project, for example, where the IZ requirement is 15% and the IZ units, the ground floor area represents 14.5% of the area, we wouldn't sort of say there's an alternative compliance in terms of bedroom mix or unit size. It's something I think we would say, let's let this amendment sort of proceed, and if Michael's particular point is presenting problems later, that's something we could address, but at this time it's not necessary for this particular time sensitive amendment. The second change regarding unit size, a few members of the commission talked about guardrails against units that might be inadequately sized. There are minimum housing standards and very small units, but there's nothing in the ordinance today that would require a minimum unit size. And so if the commission would like to engage in that discussion, we've got some Pier City precedents, and we did talk to Champlain Housing Trust and got their feedback on if minimum unit sizes were proposed, what might they be. And so I'm happy to share that now, or we can hear your discussion.
Thank you. There was I had a question. Yes, that was my question. Thank you.
I thought you might want us to answer that. So Sharon Busher asked about why, when we talked about this at the high level, we were talking about 20% of the gross floor area of a building being occupied by IZ, but this is showing 15.5. I think the reason for that at the highest level is that we envision that the % of the gross floor area that would be required to be occupied by IZ would correspond with whatever the % of IZ units is that's required. So 15% is the base, and the reason why we said 15.5 is just to make sure that it is some % more than 15 itself. There are some projects that may be required to provide 20% of their units. So in the case of 20%, it would need to be more than 20%. And then there are some projects, albeit fewer, that require 25% of their units to be IZ. So those would require 25%, more than 25% of the gross floor area to be IZ. So I think maybe the reason why Sharon heard that in the discussion was that I think it might have been the mayor actually that said that. He may have been speaking to some project specifics that he knows about in terms of the example project where this has been raised, and the fact that they may be exceeding our inclusionary requirement that we would otherwise be required.
This is a side issue on all of this. During these discussions, there are other questions and comments about the inclusionary zoning that have come up. We talked about this a little bit during our executive committee meeting, and what I think the idea is, or the plan would be, is there are some good issues that have come up that should be addressed, but to do those separately from this. This is dealing with very specific issues that are potentially inhibiting development that's ready to go. So other issues with the inclusionary zoning may be discussed later, but for now we want to just stick with the issues that are being presented here in this proposed amendment. Megan, did you have anything?
Well, I think the main question from our perspective, Charles spoke to the fact that in the revised version of this ordinance that's in your packet, we already took out the first recommended change, which was dealing with allowing bedroom mixes to exceed what the market units were providing. And are just relying on the other two to create that flexibility. We do not recommend any additional kind of tiering for the second point. So I think the question for you is really on the third one about whether you do want to consider bringing back the minimum unit sizes for the IV units. We did, for those of you that weren't here, we did talk about this a little bit at our meeting last week that the ordinance used to have them. We got rid of them because we felt that they weren't responsive to the market. But I think there was some concern that using just our housing code alone may be too small. So I don't know if you want to share that example that you had. There was a kind of note in here about potential minimum sizes that you could consider if you wanted to. But Charles had actually had a conversation with Michael Monty about
Yeah, and Michael's suggestion was very close to what we had put in the memo. Essentially, the studio 1 and 2s, he actually decreased by 50 square feet. So we had 400, 600, and 800 for studios 1s and 2s respectively. And Michael took a look at some of the projects that they've built and what they're seeing demanded, and this is basically what he proposed. This is almost identical, a little bit bigger than what is required in New York City, and I would say other larger dense cities that have inclusionary zoning programs.
it is smaller than what's required in South Burlington.
And smaller than what is required in South.
Brian,
Either way.
did you want to share that?
Only to add that, to be clear, this is only when you're using going qualifying
Yes.
for the exemption, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
for the alternative.
Alternative
Yes.
compliant.
Right.
So I just want to check with the developer in the room who has developed a bunch of small units, whether these numbers line up. If you were to go that route, would these work?
As a minimum?
Yeah.
Yeah, all of our units.
Would be that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I have some studios at 350, but all the units are larger than what we have.
So are you all set? Oh, are you all set? Okay, you're all set. Okay, so back to the commission discussion. We could discuss this further. We could ask for changes to be made, or we could warn it for a public hearing at this point. And then after the public hearing, regardless of what we do now, after the public hearing, there's also opportunities to make changes if we want.
We're having a hard time hearing you, Andy, at least I am.
Oh, sorry. I was just giving the different options of what we could do. We could have further discussion on it. We could ask for changes to be made. We could also warn it for public hearing. And then after the public hearing, we could still make changes to it if we want. What's the desire of the commission? Emily?
I'm just reading the language in the code. And I just reading it's a bedroom mix requirement established in section do not apply when the ratio of the gross floor area of all inclusionary dwelling units to the total gross floor area of all dwelling units within the project exceeds the required percentage of inclusionary units as established in the table, based on the project's average unit size and rental price. So what maybe I'm just totally glossing over this here, but what's to prevent a developer, if it's just based on floor, the total gross floor area, from building really large 1-bedroom units with only one kitchen? I think it would be really inexpensive to meet the requirement by having larger 1-bedroom units, which are more expensive to build than multiple small 1-bedroom units, but would meet the gross floor area requirement here. So what am I missing? Because I must be reading this wrong.
I'm not sure that I'm totally following the question.
It says,
I think maybe
I'm
I
reading
can
is-
try and answer it, is that I think this zoning amendment contemplates mainly developments where there's a nonprofit affordable housing developer that's partnering with the market rate developer. And I think given that, I think it's in the interest of the affordable housing developer to develop markets that they are seeing in demand in the affordable housing market, if you will. And so I think in that, from that respect, I would think, for example, that Champlain Housing Trust would not pursue that kind of approach. And I think just another thing is that in these large projects, you are more likely to see that kind of partnership, just given the financing of affordable units and the ability of affordable housing developers to sort of tap into financing that market rate developers typically can't.
And the other thing maybe that I'll just add to that, and I don't know if maybe this is kind of the core of your concern, Emily, but this doesn't remove the underlying requirement for the percentage of units that have to be provided. So what it's saying is that you still have to provide 15% of your units as IZ.
Okay,
But instead of all of those units having to match exactly the market rate units, bedroom mix, they can be bigger or smaller in terms of their bedroom mix. You still have to provide 15% of your units as IZ. But as long as 15% of that residential space is also occupied by those units. So
15%, there's a number count of units.
there is still a number count of
Okay.
units, yes.
So if the requirement is 15 units and you have a gross floor area of 15,000 square feet, because 1,000 per unit, you still have to provide the 15 and you have to have the 15,000 square feet. I guess I'm thinking like if the mix of units that the building has is more expensive to build, that the developer is going to build 1 bedroom larger units to use up that square footage rather than something.
I see what you mean, like yeah,
I'm reassured by
curious to
the
hear
count.
Eric's,
My concern was that like, it was just gonna be like, I'm gonna build 1 10,000 square foot 1 bedroom and then knock this out, you know,
right,
but
the unit count is required.
right. Since the unit count is still required, I don't know what the incentive would be to build.
yeah, I guess I didn't read in
Yeah.
here that it seems like it's, what I'm reading here is it says you can just use a gross floor area.
Well, what it actually
And
says,
for-
so this, the language that you have here on.
Section
Let's see, what
9.1.14.
page in the agenda are we on? 34.
35.
Okay, so on page 34 above it, in section 9.1.8. Sorry.
Percentage of units.
So table 9.1.8 establishes the
Percentages,
requirement, yep.
yeah, so it says the
Then-
percentage of units, so that's the number of units, right? I get
And
that.
then if you scroll down to page 35, you have here just section 9.1.14, so it's skipping a lot of sections of our ordinance. And
Okay, so
the,
the bedroom, I get it, so it qualifies, it says the bedroom mix requirement. Okay,
and then
that's-
the proportionality further down.
Okay, that answered my question. I'm always looking for the loophole here.
You're all set, Emily?
Yeah, I am, thank you.
Good, thanks. So I know this is a timely issue. Proposed zoning change. So unless people have concerns with it or questions with it, it might be worth warning it for the public hearing to keep the process moving along.
I like this in its present form.
Is that a motion?
Yes.
Friendly motion.
Second the motion, I think having those minimum unit sizes in there is, and addresses the concerns I had last time about just using floor area ratio or floor area as the metric here.
So we have a motion to warn for public hearing. We have a second. Megan and Charles, I know you're wanting to move it forward, but are there any concerns with moving it forward in this form?
Just to make sure, are you recommending minimum unit sizes
I think it's as you proposed it,
Okay.
what's in here.
in the amendment or in the slide?
In the amendment.
Okay, the only difference is in the slide that I showed, the studio 1 and 2 bedrooms were reduced by 50 square feet each. What was in your amendment? Yeah. It's a little bit bigger.
When we put your packet together, we put that as a placeholder for discussion, but we wanted to make sure to follow up with some other people before giving a final recommendation. So if we would, at this point, recommend the numbers that were in the slide that Charles shared.
All right, did you hear that, Alex?
Clarification, is that 350 or 400 square feet for a studio apartment?
For studio, it would be 350. For 1 bed, it would be 550, and for 2 bed, it would be 750.
So was that the way you intended your motion?
Yes.
I just want to make a comment that for a 2-bedroom, 750 in certain parts of the city can be a lot. If you think of a bedroom as 150 square feet, that's a good, a normal size bedroom, about an average. You add a galley kitchen and a 150 square foot living room, you should be a little lower than the 750, I think.
There will be time to take a deeper look at the numbers if you want, or we could do that now. We can do it.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Any more discussion on the motion to refer this for a public hearing? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed?
Aye.
That's unanimous. Then good. Thank you. So this will go to a public hearing, and then we'll have, again, an opportunity after the public hearing to make further changes if we want. So we'll close out that item. Item 7 is commissioner items. Are there any commissioner items? When is our next meeting?
February 14th.
February 14th. Our next, what a great day for a meeting. Okay. So our next meeting is February 14th. Any other commissioner items?
Well, if the meeting really is February 14th, shouldn't we talk about maybe meeting on a Thursday instead of a Tuesday or something? Wouldn't that be kind of the right thing to do?
Would the commission be open to changing the date? I can talk with Megan and Charles about that.
I mean, otherwise, I predict we won't have a quorum. Everyone's brave right now.
Yeah, if we look at the date, it might be.
I want to go ahead and schedule it for the 16th.
Eve,
Folks
you old
available on the
softy.
16th?
Say that again.
Take a look at your calendar. Steve, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
It could be remote, you know, we could do it all from like.
I don't think we'd have many people at public forum. Let's put it that way.
That is true as well.
Great date idea.
I'll be remote again from my seat at Chatteria.
Yeah.
16th is fine for me.
Yeah, that's great.
Megan and
That's
Charles,
great.
be flexible.
Yeah, I think we'll have to figure out some hearing notice stuff, but yeah. We can do it.
Okay. Good. So we'll change our meeting date, our next one to Thursday and Tuesday. So February 16th instead of some random February 14th. Then on to minutes of communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications?
Yes.
Motion by Julia, second by Alex. Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have our minutes of communications. Item 9 is adjournment. Motion to adjourn by. Whose hand went up? Bruce, seconded by. Julia. Eves and Julia both seconded. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
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 Stand adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank
See you.
you.
Have a nice Have a nice Valentine's Day, speaking of which.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.